Right, thank you very much. Hopefully everybody can hear me and see me. Welcome all to this first um, of hopefully a few Scotland agronomy updates. Um, we're going to kick off with some housekeeping. So Maya, if you can click over to the next slide, please. Thank you. And the next one. So here we go. So yes, obviously I am Adrian. I am the KEM for Scotland Cereals and Oilseeds. If you don't know, you will all be muted. All attendees. You can ask, typing your questions. We'll show you how to do that in a second. Hopefully we will keep it to an hour, but we have a huge amount to try and get in, so I do apologize now if we do slightly run over. There will be a recording sent out if you have to disappear before we finish, so the recording will come along in a few days. And there is a survey for you to fill in after, so please do that so that we can improve on this. If you have a question that you want to ask, then use the square at the bottom of the screen and just type it into the chat, and I will ask the relevant person as we're going along. We will try and fit in as many questions as we can during the sessions. If we have any that we don't get to, I will follow them up with the relevant people and get back to you. Okay, Maya? Right, so if we can kick off firstly with Morven. We're very lucky to have Morven with us from Hutchinson's. So Morven, over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. Yep, so a bit of an introduction to myself. So I'm Morven Nimmo and I'm based in the Fife area working for Hutchinson's. Do a broad range of arable crops, cereals and oilseeds, and also into potatoes. So today was just to give you an update in terms of what we're seeing out in the field at the moment. Okay, so next slide. So winter wheat at the moment, I'm sure it's of no surprise to anyone that we're experiencing quite a high yellow rust pressure this season. There's been a few notes sent out, I believe, by AHDB about new yellow rust races coming in and kind of overcoming a lot of the varietal resistance that we have had in the likes of Typhoon. Seeing it particularly in the later zone varieties that are at a more juvenile stage. Of course, we'd expect the varietal resistance to start kicking in at a later stage. And I do believe I am starting to see that in the field a lot more now. So the more forward crops, there's a lot of yellow rust. There is a lot less yellow rust in them, I would say. Even in some of the varieties like Skyscraper, where we would expect to see a lot. The pressure is highest in those coastal areas, but I would say it is still quite widespread. So this year, if there ever was a year that we're going to get a yield response from the TNOT application, I would say it is now. That being said, yellow rust is obviously not the only disease we need to consider at this point in time. Septoria levels are off the chart in a lot of varieties, especially the older ones like Skyscraper. Surprisingly, we're seeing a lot of septoria in the likes of Bamford as well. So we just need to pay attention to that and make sure that you are choosing your T1 fungicides appropriately. Obviously, the neurochemistry having a better effect on the likes of septoria. Mildew, we're seeing a fair bit of mildew at the base of Beowulf at the moment, particularly in the thicker crops that are a little bit further forward. And in terms of the growth stages, we've got the earlier sown where forward crops are ready at T1, with leaf 3 fully out, leaf 2 even just poking out. All we're saying on that front is, of course, if you're applying your T1 slightly earlier, you just need to watch the gap between your T1 and your T2 fungicide. Going over 3 weeks between those two T timings is suboptimal. And if you're going early, we would recommend that you bridge the gap and almost go with the T1.5. That is the caveat of going slightly earlier. But then again, some may say that if leaf 3 is there, it's there. All our fungicides are protecting, and once septoria gets onto leaf 3, there's no going back in a lot of cases. So basically treat by what you're seeing in the field is the main message. The majority of the crops are not quite yet T1 yet, I would say. I think a lot of them will be getting acted upon from the end of next week, as opposed to these earlier ones. I have observed like a high level of scorch this year, and it's not biased towards any certain grass weed herbicides. It comes from quite a wide range of products being applied. And I think quite a lot of that is due to the diurnal fluctuations we've been seeing in terms of those frostier evenings. Also noticed that products with flagellum, so the likes of Samir or potentially even Spitfire, they have been a little bit slower to act this season. We are starting to see more activity from them now, but it's just something to be aware of when you're walking the likes of your wheats, that you might not have your broadleaf weeds taken out fully yet. Also, just a little something to add in the end. It does look like we're in for a bit of a stressful season in some areas, especially those that haven't experienced very much rainfall yet. So could this be the season that you get more of a response from biostimulants, such as the likes of amino acids, seaweeds, that kind of idea, to alleviate some of this crop stress? If you are interested in using some of these products, I'd always recommend you front load them. So always try and use them earlier in the program as opposed to later, because we want that to be in the crop ahead of the stress. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so this is just an example of some of the yellow rust pressure we're seeing in the field. So you can see on the left-hand side here, that was an application of a product called Gembe. So it's a mixture of bromuconazole and thioconazole. So that's taken out the yellow rust really well in that case, but same product, same rate, different field that's got a slightly higher level of yellow rust in it. It did take out the majority, but there is some pustules still there, still slightly active. So we do need to be watching that and making sure that we're taking note of where yellow rust is still active, even if the T-knot was applied, and particularly if you didn't go with a T-knot. Next slide. So just to round upon some of the other winter cereals. Winter rye, we're now coming into the stage of having the T1 application. So you'd be putting in a nice well-rounded mix of herbicide to tidy up your broadleaf weeds, a bit of PGR, fungicide, trace elements. Obviously, there's not too many diseases that affect rye. So again, just look at your field and assess disease pressure and go from there. Winter oats, most crops will have already had their herbicides applied. For winter oats, we've got usually got a growth stage cutoff about growth stage 31, 32, so coming into stem extension. So I would hope that most have been applied, if not are about to be applied. T1 is also just about due in winter oats. And we are seeing a high level of mildew this season in the majority of varieties, as you can see in the top of the picture there. Particularly, again, the likes of those stronger winter oat crops are quite thick, that have got that humid canopy at the bottom. Winter barley has been looking quite stressful this season, but where we have had recent rainfall and the fertiliser is now washed in, it is starting to ramp on. And again, I would expect T1 to be applied very soon in the next couple of days, if not already applied. I am seeing signs of ramularia on some fields, especially those that are on lighter ground. Ramularia being the disease that manifests a lot more when you do have crop stress, so it does make sense that on the lighter ground that is present already. A lot of brown rust this year, so similar to the yellow rust in wheat crops, we're seeing brown rust in winter barley crops, and net blotch. So there may be a case of looking at whether the net blotch is coming in with seed in a future year. And I do predict that I think Rhynchosporium levels are going to be on the up after the rain that we're currently experiencing. Next slide. And winter oilseed rape. So I would say overall we've seen a lower level of cabbage stem flea beetle level this year. I don't think that's limited or constrained to Scotland. I do think that's been across the whole of the UK, which has been a nice pleasant experience for most. The caveat to that is that we have seen quite a lot of pigeon pressure. So I am suggesting some of my growers that we might like to do some sort of bordering companion crop, if you will, or game cover to try and detract the pigeons from the oilseed rape in future, as they have been quite heavily on the crop this year. That being said, the crops that have escaped pigeon damage are coming nicely into flower. A lot of them are nice and even across the surface, and they are looking nice and yellow across the field already. Some may be turning to whether we now go into the likes of the Sclerotinia flowering sprays. It is currently low chance or low risk for sclerotinia, because not only do we need the warm, moist soils, we also need high humidity and nighttime temperatures of over 8 degrees. Obviously, we've had quite cold evenings and nights for the past week or so. That might start to change in the next upcoming 2 weeks. So all I would say to that is, yes, we've had low pressure when it comes to sclerotinia so far, but the fungicides that we use, they work on a protectant basis. So I would, if your crop is coming into flower, I would still be targeting that mid-flowering time on the main raceme before significant petal fall. Make sure that you're getting those petals coated with your fungicide, and giving yourself a good level of protection. Watch out for cabbage seed weevil. There is definitely more of them about. Finding them whenever you go into the field at the moment, really, you'll find them crawling over you, or finding them in your car. And plant nutrition is something that shouldn't be shunned. I've seen a really good response to using boron in oilseed rape and almost drip feeding it through the season for the past couple of years. So I'd always recommend adding in some boron when you're going through the oilseed rape with a fungicide or other treatment. Next slide. And on to spring crops. Overall, I would say spring crops are emerging well, and they're emerging evenly in the large part. Caveat that is, obviously there is areas where we've not had the same level of rainfall. The soils are quite dry. So I do think we'll have a few areas that are struggling a little bit for spring barley emergence. But on the whole, I mean, if you look at this year in comparison to last, we're a lot further ahead, and the season is looking a lot more positive, effectively. Where we have had the rainfall, we'd expect good activity from those residual herbicides in terms of annual meadowgrass control, which is real positive. Spring and winter beans, again, just watch out for weevil, this time pea and bean weevil. So in terms of pea and bean weevil, you're looking for the notches on the edges of the leaves. And the critical thing with that is it's not the adult feeding damage that is the main issue with pea and bean weevil. It's actually the larvae that will go underground and feed on the root nodules of the bean plants themselves. So keep an eye out for pea and bean weevil. They do like to hide in the crevices of like more cloddier soil. So if you do have a rougher ground surface, that's something to watch out for in terms of a riskier scenario. Watch out for the first signs of chocolate spot coming in. You can go with a pre-flowering spray if your pressure starts to build early. But otherwise, we'd usually expect to use 2 flowering fungicides, usually 3 to 4 weeks apart. And on winter beans, I would expect us to be going in with that in the next couple of weeks or so. And spring peas, not too many grown in my area, but we have had them starting to get drilled, and preems are going on just due to limited post-stem options. So that's looking good as well at the moment. Next slide. Yeah, that's it from me.
Morven, thank you very much for that. That was great. Really great update on where we are. I don't see any questions that have come in for you, so I know you do want to get away as fast as you can because you've got other stuff going on. Just one question from me. You mentioned obviously different levels of rainfall across Scotland. We all know it's been incredibly dry this spring so far for us. In my little corner of Fife, we had about 15 mils of rain in March, and we've had so far. I was away last week, but I haven't been back this week. We've had just over 20 mils this week. Are you saying that that's pretty similar to the rest of Scotland, or have other places had a bit more or a bit less?
It ranges so much from county to county, I would say. I was speaking to one of my colleagues who's based down in East Linton this morning, and he's had absolutely nowt.
Wow.
So the soils are very dry. He almost watches painstakingly as the rain clouds passes him by.
Yeah.
But of course, like up into Aberdeenshire, they've had a little bit more. But
Right.
I think overall we're down on average, without a doubt.
Yeah. Oh, certainly, and certainly, yeah. We'll try not to remember last year because yes, Right, more than well. As I say, there's no questions for you, but thank you, excellent for tonight. It's been brilliant, and yeah, hopefully we'll speak soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Right, moving on quickly then. Moving on to one of my own colleagues, Emma, who is going to talk about IPM.
Thank you, Adrian. I will just get my presentation up. Thank you. So I'm going to just give everybody an introduction into integrated pest management. So what is integrated pest management? Well, it's an approach to crop protection that utilises a multitude of approaches, for example, cultural control, varietal selection and pesticide application. And this is to manage pest, weeds and diseases in an effective and sustainable way. So when we first start looking at IPM, we look at the triangle, and the triangle, you start from the bottom up with IPM. So at the bottom, we're looking first at prevention. So when we use integrated pest management point of view, how can we prevent the pest in the first place? So this can be agronomic practices, for example, your rotations, using resistant or tolerant plant varieties, and looking at increasing those predators and parasitoids amongst the populations, and looking at your sowing dates and stubble management. The step above here, we're looking at the decision support. And this is the detection level. So that is looking at the monitoring and forecasting and warning systems. And then the final step will be the control element. So we're looking at sort of mechanical, physical, and biological control. So biological, you can see in the triangle there, that is more for your horticultural crops, and more research is needed into biological control for your arable crops. So when there's more on the market and more research and information out there, then it's definitely something to consider. And then finally at the top, you've got your chemical control. And this is for all weeds, pests and diseases. And I'm just going to run through some examples for winter wheat now. So looking at the bottom of the triangle, your prevention. So we've got agronomic practices in winter wheat. So we'll look at disease septoria. So when you're looking at preventing septoria within your crop, or looking to prevent it as much as you possibly can, first of all, you can look at your variety choice. So if you have a high RL rating, that can reduce yield loss caused by the disease and give you more flexibility in the fungicide timings. A higher risk would be early drilling. So if you're wanting to prevent it, then look at later drilling. So from that mid-October point. And that is because when you drill earlier, they're exposed to the incoming aquaspores for a longer period of time, giving your plants a higher risk of getting the disease. Next, we'll look at a pest. So we'll look at slugs. So a high risk factor of having slugs are heavy soils or high trash levels, wet weather before or just after drilling, poorly consolidated seed beds, and a field history that is known to having high slug pressure. So really, when it comes to your prevention, your soil management is key. So cultivations is the best method in killing the slugs, and even a lighter cultivation is still better than direct drilling if you've got high slug pressure. So slug numbers can drop on certain soil types and when the timing, depth and intensity of cultivations are correct. You're also looking for a fine firm seed bed by rolling it, because then it's harder for the slugs to move and hide, and it can help those crops get off to a good strong start. And also look out for high risk points within your rotation. So for example, after leafy crops or seed rape. They do love moist, weedy fields. And then finally, I have chosen that we'll have a look at sterile brome. So if you've got brome within your fields, it's important, first of all, to be able to look at what type of brome it is. So I'm looking here at sterile brome, but there are also other types of brome like the soft bromes. So when we're looking specifically at this sterile barren brome, cultivate and bury the seeds as soon as possible after harvest is a great IPM prevention tool for it. So you're looking at having that stale seed bed, delaying your autumn drilling, so then you've got more chance to control the brome with cultivations and or glyphosate. Looking at vigorous varieties for competition and higher seed rates, And you can even look at spring cropping. It might not actually be appropriate to put in a winter crop if you've got such a high burden, because that creates a wider window to get those IPM practices in place to try and control the brome. And finally, better farm hygiene. So with any grass weeds, we want to reduce the risk of getting or spreading the weed infestations. So looking at cleaning machinery between fields. If you've got a high risk field going into a low risk, we don't want to spread the seeds. And also when it comes to brome, mowing the grass margins or field edges before the seeds spreads can help limit the spread if it's coming in from your grass margins. So the next part of the triangle, we're looking at detection and decision support for your winter wheat with these three. So first of all, disease with Septoria. So Morven's given us a great introduction into what the current situation is with Septoria in the field. And it's also important to be thinking about your disease ratings. So understanding what variety you've got in the field, disease risk rating, as well as that crop walking. And the climatic conditions throughout the seasons, as Morven's alluded to, can also help with understanding your risks. So if we get wet weather, especially during May and June, and windy weather, which can increase the physical spread of the spores with sort of mild weather, that can increase the risk. And once those spores land on a new leaf, primarily through splash dispersal, but also can be done airborne, it takes 12 hours for the spore to germinate, infect the new leaf. Infection of the new leaf usually takes place within 24 hours of the spore landing, and symptoms will appear after sort of 14 to 28 day latent period. So that's where it's really key when Morven was referring to those protectant fungicides, because you might not physically be able to see the disease, but it might be sort of taking place within the leaf. Next, we've got slugs as a pest. So trapping is really the only effective way of monitoring your slug activity when you're drilling it in the autumn for this sort of winter wheat example, and you're looking at the soil surface when it's moist and the slugs are active, and you can also check for hollowing. So the slug threshold for cereals are 4 or more slugs per trap if you find them. We have got spring crops in the ground, and they usually grow faster in the warmer soil. It may depend on your region, the rainfall that you've had recently, with actually how fast they are growing. But they genuinely tend to be that less vulnerable to autumn crops, but we do need to take the year season into account when we're looking at that. So don't ignore slug risk altogether, especially high risk fields in your spring cereals. And then finally, with your sterile brome or regular crop inspections and monitoring will really help to see and that identifying whether it is sterile or soft brome that you've got in your population. So control, we'll look at the disease for Septoria first. So disease management. So after monitoring the crops regularly, treat the infection before the infection becomes well established, you're looking at using fungicides where risk or present warrants it. So using a dose that will give effective disease control and is appropriate for the pressure, never exceeding that recommended dose or number of applications, making full use of those different modes of actions in mixtures or as alternative sprays in a programme, and avoiding repeat applications of the same product or mode of action. So I have included the FRAC table on the right hand side here, and that provides information on the different modes of actions of different fungicides. And the knowledge of this is really critical for agronomists to look at effective resistance management strategies. So over time, repeated use of fungicides with the same mode of action can lead to development of resistant strains of fungi. So by diversifying the modes of actions, agronomists can slow down the development of resistance. So you're looking at matching fungicides to the primary disease risk, which depends mainly on variety, sowing date, location, and local weather, and looking at mixtures and alternatives of fungicides with different modes of actions to help with that disease risk. And Georgia will go into this in more detail when she shows you our fungicide performance data. Next, we've got slugs. So our control option really is ferric phosphate, and that works by the slugs stopping feeding. They become less mobile and die within 3 to 6 days. They do often die underground, so the effectiveness of the treatment does need to be measured by the decreasing of feeding damage of the crop. By this point, we'll start seeing the shredding of the leaves if they're in place. So we need to be looking at application, whether a second one is required or not, or whether a first one has done it. And application is most effective when slugs are active up and until that sort of growth stage 14. Finally, when we're looking at controlling of grass weeds, and for this example, barren brome, we are looking to make sure that we are using a sufficient dose rate for the target and its growth stage. So we're looking here at the right size, right rate for the size and the species in the weed spectrum. Correct application technique to get the best control. So looking at your sprayer setup, making sure it's maintained, calibrated and serviced. And looking at the operation, so looking at whether you've got the correct nozzle choice, your forward speed and water quality, reducing those physical losses by drift, runoff and bounce, and for some chemistry, chemical losses, so pH, hard water can reduce the quality of the actives reaching the target. An example of that is glyphosate, and glyphosate being in the news and the press over the last few months with glyphosate resistance being found in the UK. It's important that we are protecting our modes of chemistry so that we prevent any more resistance being found. And correct conditions. So the chemistry that you're using, does the need to be actively growing? Will it be if rain's forecast, what's the rainfast of it? And that sort of elements. And also mixing the modes of actions and spot treating, or you can mechanical weed as well. And that is everything from me today. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emma. Again, excellent stuff. Again, we have no questions for you, but I will ask a question. I think because you are based in the middle of England, if I remember rightly.
Yes.
So what are the crops looking like down there, just out of interest for us Scottish growers?
We are also in desperate need of rain directly where we are, but not far away from me. Earlier on in the week, they had about 10 centimetres of rain and we were treated to 1 mil. So spring crops are sort of struggling out the ground at the moment. Preems haven't worked quite as well as we'd hoped with the lack of moisture. And the winter crops are sort of, at or approaching that sort of T1 timing as well. But really, rain is what we're needing right now. But it does mean that broadleaf weeds are quite low. The pressure is in our area, but I'm sure once we get some rain, they will suddenly start appearing again.
Okay, brilliant. Right. Well, thanks, Emma. We will move on to next one, which is Georgia.
Thanks, Adrian. So, evening, everyone. I'm Georgia, and I'm a crop protection scientist at AHDB. And as Adrian said, I'm going to give you an overview of the AHDB fungicide performance project that covers wheat, barley, and oilseed rape. So, for those of you who might not be familiar, what is the fungicide performance project? So, the project tests the efficacy of fungicide products across different crops and diseases. So in winter oilseed rape, we have 2 trials for foamer stem canker and 2 trials for light leaf spot. For winter barley, we have 2 net blotch trials, 1 ramularia trial, and then 3 rhynchosporium trials. And we also have 1 spring barley ramularia trial. And then for winter wheat, we've got 1 trial each for yellow rust, brown rust, and fusarium, and then 7 trials for septoria, as these trials also feed into our fungicide resistance project. We try to include products a few years prior to their registration, and we test these ones under code so that we're able to provide efficacy data soon after these projects are registered, and we provide this alongside data for those more established products. Fungicides are tested at 4 different dose rates. So for cereals, this is quarter, half, the full label rate, and then twice the label rate. And then for oilseed rape, this is quarter, a half, 3/4, and the full label rate just for the PGR effects that some of those products have. We present these results annually at the AHDB Agronomy Conference, which anybody can attend. This is usually in December, and then we release the presentation online shortly afterwards. We do present the graphs up to 200% at the agronomy conference, but online and then in this presentation, I'm only going to show them up to 100%, as obviously this is your maximum label rate. So the main outcome from our fungicide performance project is the dose response curves, and they are a reliable, independent and robust data on the effectiveness of fungicides and their different modes of action. And by testing the products prior to registration, we're able to release early information on those new active substances and show their potential to improve disease control and their efficacy at different dose rates. So AHDB has been running the fungicide performance project since 1994 for wheat, 2002 for barley, and then 2006 for oilseed rape. And what this allows us to do is see those long-term trends in the product efficacy and identify the shifts in dose response and field performance due to the changes in pathogen sensitivity. And this data can also be used to reduce your fungicide usage and therefore your cost on farm if you're able to choose your minimum effective. So as I previously mentioned, some of the fungicide performance trials are sampled for our resistance monitoring work that we do in Septoria in winter wheat. And the trials that target Septoria are sampled both early season and then again in the season later on. And this allows us to determine the impact of those specific fungicide applications on the sensitivity status of those sampled Septoria populations. And this enables us to identify the fungicide resistance mechanisms that we see in those insensitive isolates. What this monitoring does is help us safeguard the future efficacy of products, hopefully promoting the responsible use of the available chemistry. And these results also feed into the fungicide resistance action group guidance, which aims to help reduce the risk of developing resistance. So just a bit of background on the trial methods before we move on to look at the dose response curves. So the trials are set up to maximise the difference between each treatment for each disease, and we use locations that are very high risk for that disease to try and get maximum infection. We also use varieties that are highly susceptible to that target disease, but we try to still use one that's on the current recommended list where possible, just because that's what growers will be using. We also use a single spray timing for cereals, and that is dependent on the disease. So the dose response graphs, they show the average performance of a product over a number of trial sites, a number of years and a number of leaf layers. Sometimes we apply cover spray to these trials that aren't active against the target disease so that we can reduce the effect of non-target diseases and really just focus on that one disease. An example being last year, obviously it was such a high brown rust year. So in some of our Septoria trials, we did use a cover spray against brown rust. Some of the diseases that we look at, we split the activity into either protectant or eradicant activity. And as you can see in the little diagram on the right, we note the leaf layers emerged at the time of spraying, and then we use this to determine the activity based on the emergence of each leaf at that time. So you can see on moving across the arrow, the disease control measured on leaf 1 and 2 assessment will be protectant, as they're either yet to emerge or just emerged at the time of spraying. And then the control on leaves 3 and 4 will be eradicant, as they had been emerged for some time. So even if your disease symptoms aren't visible, they might still be in that latent period. So just to give you an idea of the locations of our trials, these are the wheat trials from 2024. And you can see again that we try to locate these trials in areas where we expect high pressure for that disease. So an example is the yellow rust trial is located in Tarrington in East Anglia, but our Septoria trials cover more of the UK. For Scotland specifically, we had 2 Septoria trials. One was in East Lothian targeting the T2 timing, and then one in Dundee targeting the T1 timing. Moving on to the products that we tested last year. So this was the ones tested in 2024. We had a Presso, which was registered last year, but I'm not sure that it's commercially available yet. I can't see it on the Bayer website, but maybe the agronomist would correct me on that one. We also tested a further 6 products, again under code, and we can release this data upon registration. Plaxium was also registered last year, but this had been in trial in 2019, 2020 and 2021. If you're interested, you can see the full press release on the AHDB website, and I'll cover a few of the Plaxium slides a little bit later in the presentation. As you can see, we tried to cover a range of active ingredients and modes of action, as well as products which are either a single active ingredient and a couple that are mixture products, but we are limited to around 10 products in each trial. So we've got limited time, so I'm just going to present the over years data to you today, starting with Septoria in that protectant situation from 22 to 24, and we had valid data from 16 trials. So on the right in the wheat slides will be the products that are a single active ingredient, and then the graph on the left will be the mixture products. But we do use the same axis without, so you can see that they both are at 25%, so that you can compare the products across the graphs. We can see that Miravis Plus is giving the best control, and then with Univoc and Pectiga performing quite similarly to each other, and Vimoy and Myrisa are also performing quite comparably. You can see that all the products are giving better control than the Arizona and the Proline, which are the little diamond shapes, and these are only included at the full label rate in the Septoria trials. Moving on to the eradicant data, we had 4 trials worth of data. Miravis Plus and Univoc are performing more similarly in an eradicant situation than the protectant situation. Pectiga is performing less well at those lower doses, but at the full label rate it's giving similar control to Miravis Plus. And then Espresso, Vimoy and Revistar and Myrisa again are giving a similar level of control to each other. So one benefit of the fungicide performance trials, like I said, that long data set, we're able to see changes in efficacy. So I've included at this slide to give you a bit of an idea of how the product efficacy can shift over a space of time. And again, highlight how important it can be to use those minimum effective doses. So we're reducing the exposure of the diseases to the chemistry. So if we focus on Miravis Plus, which is the grey line there, you can see it was giving almost a half of Septoria in 2020. Even at that 25% dose rate, but by 2024 this has already fallen to 80% and it's giving less control at those lower doses. Some of the products do have a little bit more stability, so if you look at the Myrisa there in the orange line, it hasn't shifted as much since 2022, but yeah, again, the fungicide performance data is really good for showing these long-term trends. Looking at yellow rust, we had 3 trials worth of data because we only have one of those trials each year. Alatus Plus is giving the best control, showing a similar reduction in disease levels even at that 25% rate. Espresso and Univoc are offering a similar reduction to Alatus Plus, but only when we get to that full label rate. And Revistar, Myrisa and Vimoy are performing quite comparably. Moving on, we've got the data for the brown rust, again with 3 trials worth of data. Revistar is providing the best control at that 50% rate. If you look at those individual points of 50% and 100%, it's giving a similar level of control. And then Espresso, Myrisa and Vimoy are all performing quite comparably to each other, and Pectiga giving the least control. Finally, for wheat, we've got the head blight data, and these trials are inoculated so that we get sufficient levels of disease. Miravis Plus, they're clearly giving the best control even at that 25% dose rate. And then Proline's giving better control than Myrisa at that full label rate. Moving on to the barley data, again, just to show you the locations of the different trials and the diseases that we used from each trial. So for Scotland, again, we have 2 barley, one in Lanark, which is targeting Rhynchosporium, and then another in Midlothian, which is targeting Ramularia. And in the barley that we managed to use a couple of diseases from each of the trials, so that's always a bonus. These are the products in barley in 2024. In addition to Espresso in barley, we also had ReviPro, and that one does appear on the BASF website, so I think that one is commercially available. Yeah, again, there are 4 products tested under code, and we'll release data on these when they're registered. So unlike the wheat charts, we've got on the left, and then eradicant data. And each graph shows both the mixture products alongside the straights. So for Rhynchosporium, we had 5 trials of protectant data and 4 trials of eradicant data. So your Ascot X Pro, Espresso and Miravis Plus are giving the best control in a protectant situation, and Imtrex also there giving a good level of control. And then in an eradicant situation on the right, Ascot X Pro, Espresso and Imtrex are all giving quite similar levels of control. And then Miravis Plus is giving a similar performance at the 25% rate to Ascot X Pro, again giving the same level of control at its 50% dose rate. Moving on to the net blotch data, we've got 3 trials each of protectant and eradicant. At the full label rate, Moravis Plus is giving the highest level of control in both situations, and Myreesa is performing comparably to Moravis Plus in a protection situation. Apresso and Ascra Expro are giving the next highest levels of control, but just note the different scales for the eradicant data and the protectant data, and also the eradicant data goes back to 2021. Finally, for barley, we've got the Ramularia data, 9 trials of valid data. A little bit more of a simple graph for Ramularia. We've only got 4 registered products. So you can see Moravis Plus there giving Myreesa and Apresso performing quite similarly, and then Proline giving the least level of control. Moving on to the oilseed rape, there were no new products last year, but we do have 4 unregistered products under test. So the oilseed rape graphs are a little busy, but this does include all the registered products from 2015 to 2024. I'm not going to read out all the names, you'll be pleased to hear, but you can see that the products that are giving a good level of disease control are seeing that similar uplift in yield. And you can also see that most of the products are giving a comparable level of control at that 50% dose rate, and some even at the 25% dose rate compared with that full label rate. So using the lowest effective dose is really a good way to manage your fungicide resistance risk and the benefit of cutting costs on farm. So this is the data for light leaf spot, again a bit busier, but the majority of the products do perform quite similarly. You can see that Aviator and Shepherd are giving good levels of control and showing the same uplift in yield. To note with the light leaf spot data is the percentage severity can sometimes look quite low, but this is due to the way that the trials are run. So at the time of assessment, the plants are large, so it can look quite low. Trial sets after validation and scrutinisation from both AHDB and specialist members of our fungicide working group who run the trials, and that applies to all the data sets, not just the light leaf spot. Another thing to note is the light leaf spot trials do receive 2 spray treatments. The first is at or before the first symptoms in October or early November, and then the second when symptoms are readily found in the treated plots. So this one is Scotland specific. This is just the light leaf spot data from Midlothian in 2024. And you can see that Proline and Propulse there are giving similar levels of control. And yeah, Aviator is quite similar to those 2 at that full label rate. Finally, for oilseed rape, I'll quickly cover the sclerotinia. So we no longer run specific trials targeting sclerotinia, so this is historic data from 2015 to 17. And just to note that all the modes of action available for your sclerotinia control can now be used elsewhere in the programme. So the Proline, Propulse and Aviator there giving the best level of control even at that 50% rate. I'll quickly just cover a few charts for Plaxium. As I mentioned, this was only included in fungicide performance trials in 2019 to 21, so I couldn't show it alongside that previous data set. We'll start with the wheat, and I'll try to just focus on the Plaxium, as I don't know about anyone getting a bit chart blind. Again, this is 19 to 21, but Moravis Plus was giving the highest level of control there in your septoria. And again, you can see that shift that we've had in the efficacy of Moravis Plus, as I'd highlighted in the previous graph. But in 21, yeah, Plaxium and Univoc were giving equal levels of control. Moving on to eradicant data for septoria, Moravis Plus giving a slight advantage over the Plaxium, but Plaxium, Univoc and Revstar performing quite similarly. For yellow rust, I mean, it's pretty hard to separate all of the products. They're all giving a pretty equal level of control there. For brown rust, Plaxium, Alatus Plus and Imtrex were giving a very similar level of control, but you can see that Plaxium there at the 25% dose rate has almost reduced the disease pressure to 0. Moving on to the barley data for Plaxium, this is Rhynchosporium in a protectant situation. So the majority of the products, including Plaxium, again comparably, with only the Proline there sticking out as providing a little less control. This is Rhynchosporium in an eradicant situation. Again, quite comparable control, with the Plaxium maybe being slightly ahead, and that 50% dose rate minimum giving you comparable control. So for net blotch in an eradicant situation, Plaxium and Ascra X Pro are performing quite well, just behind Moravis Plus there. For ramularia, we've got Moravis Plus giving the highest level of control, followed by the Plaxium and the Revastar, which are performing quite comparably to each other. You'll be pleased to hear this is the last graph from me. So we no longer run the powdery mildew trials, but in Plaxium is giving the best level of control, even at that 25% dose rate, and Moravis Plus also showing a good level of control at the 25% rate. So you can use the QR code when these slides go out to see the full slide deck from the agronomy conference, and you can also use the QR code there to access the fungicide resistance action group guidance that we host. So just a final thank you for everybody from the fungicide working group that helped do everything from running the trials to validating and presenting the data. And that is everything from me.
Georgia, thank you very much. That was quite a feat getting all of that into that short period of time. We do have a question for you. So this person is asking, why would efficiency of Moravis have dropped between 21 and 22, 100% to 80%, when it wasn't approved and wasn't being used by growers?
That is a good question. It might just be changes in the populations of the diseases. So it might not necessarily be caused by the use of Moravis. Like you said, it's not been registered for use for very long. So it's not always because people aren't using that minimum effective dose. It might just be that there's been a natural change in the populations of the disease, which might be causing the fungicide to be less effective.
Brilliant. Thank you, Georgia. Hopefully that was a suitable answer. The person can get back in touch and ask again if they suit. Right, Georgia, thank you very much. We are going to run a bit late, I think, Olivia, but yeah, press on as best you can. Olivia, sorry, we can't hear you. Can you hear us? We can't hear you, I'm afraid. Still not hearing anything. No, afraid not. No. I knew it would let us down at some point in this hour. No, afraid not. Still not getting anything. We can see your screen, but we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Ah, whatever you've done, that is perfect. Crack on.
Great. Okay, so I'll just get straight into it then. I'm just going to give a bit of a grain and oilseed market update as sort of what's going on with prices at the moment. Obviously, quite a lot going on geopolitically as well, so it's quite an interesting period at the moment for markets. So I'm going to start off by covering off the sort of global side of things, and then also going into the more domestic picture and sort of piecing the two together, and how those global influences are changing our domestic market prices. So just to start off with, if we have a quick look at what happened with grain prices over the last year or so. So on here, we've got a few different futures contracts. So we've got that domestic market in the blue, and then also some Chicago prices and the Paris maize price as well. You can see that generally we didn't see huge fluctuations over the last year compared to sort of 2023 and 2022. And from sort of July, so the start of the marketing year, to about sort of February, March, prices moved relatively sideways. UK prices didn't really go far from sort of £210 a tonne down to £190 a tonne. But since then, so sort of February, March time onwards, we've probably seen a bit more volatility in those markets and a bit more reaction to sort of fundamentals and those geopolitical side of things as well. You can also probably notice that sort of relationship between those contracts has changed quite a bit. So you can see back in sort of August time, the discount of Chicago maize versus our domestic price was quite significant. And if you compare that to more recently, that discount has closed in a lot, and the price relationship between wheat and maize has gotten closer. So that's quite important, because it sort of underpins the market, and the more support that we have in maize, the more likely we are, well, the less likely we are to see wheat prices drop down, because we're sort of competing with those maize prices as well. So that's sort of an overview of price. If we also just have sort of a basic look at total grain supply and demand globally this year as well. At the moment, these are USDA figures, so they put out estimates each month. And at the moment, we're looking at about 2.29 billion tonnes of global grain production. And if we look at that versus global demand is expected to reach about 2.314 billion tonnes. So that basically leaves us with a deficit of 22 million tonnes of grain, which is quite a significant amount compared to what we'd usually expect. So that sort of poses the question as to why have we not seen more support in those prices over the last year or so. And I think probably the key answer to that is sort of concern over global GDP and economic growth, and what that means for global demand more long term moving forward. So just for a bit of context, this global demand figure, 2.3 billion tonnes, is up about 1% from last year, whereas pre-COVID we'd probably expect global demand to increase by about 2 or 3% year on year. But since COVID, we haven't seen that kind of recovery in economic growth globally, and specifically China is a big part of that. So actually they're expected to see a fall in GDP in 2025, and obviously that feeds a lot into global feed grain demand, and causes sort of a bearish sentiment in the wider grains market. Another thing that's sort of adding that bearish sentiment is the reliance on South American and US maize. The market seems to be sort of focusing on the fact that we've got these big crops coming, even though the balance is still quite tight. And that's sort of, again, holding those prices down a little bit from where we might expect. So some other key factors to watch in 2025. On the sort of bearish side of things, so in terms of what's pulling down the price or underpinning the price, are those strong maize crop expectations in Brazil and the US. So at the moment, they're planting in the US. There's still a bit of uncertainty about that, because obviously it's only just going in the ground. We're hearing about sort of variable weather conditions. So I think they had it quite dry sort of the last week or two, but all of a sudden they've got a lot of rain in some parts of the Corn Belt, and I think they're struggling with sort of flooding and getting those spring crops in. So still a bit of a question mark over the US crop, but we are expecting heavy supplies in Brazil. And the Brazil, the safrina crop, which is sort of the second maize crop, that's currently in its silking phase, so it's quite a key time at the moment for monitoring what's going on weather-wise in the key producing regions of Brazil as well. We've obviously got the risk of trade disputes. So you'll notice that that's actually on both sides of this sort of scale, because it's basically creating a lot of volatility. So depending on what news we get and whether, the announcement of further tariffs or retaliation of tariffs or the suspension of tariffs, we're kind of seeing the markets sort of go either way, depending on the news that's coming out that day. And it's quite difficult to know the impact that's going to have longer term, because everything's obviously not finalised just yet. I will say that it probably affects the oilseed side of things more than the grain side of things, because we trade a lot more oilseeds globally than we do grain. So probably not kind of a bigger factor on the grain markets, but it is still having some impact. Again, that global GDP picture that I just spoke about, and also positive EU yield prospects. So as you'd probably expect, things are looking a lot better than they were this time last year, and that's sort of weighing a bit on prices. On the other side of things, some factors that could lead to a bit of support. Again, as I just mentioned, we had a bit of dry weather in the US, so condition scores for the winter wheat crop a little bit poorer than what you'd maybe hoped for kind of a month or two ago. We've also got a slower Black Sea export pace. Again, sort of the US have tried to sort of broker conversations between Russia and Ukraine, and that's still a bit of a question mark at the moment as to where we're going to get with that and what that's going to mean for Black Sea exports longer term. And we've also got a rebound in spring barley area a contraction of the spring barley area in the EU as well after that bigger crop last season. So at the moment in global grain markets, we've sort of got a bit of a balance at the moment of sort of bearish and bullish factors, and that's what's sort of leading to the long-term sideways movement in prices. But obviously we've still got that volatility at the moment, largely on the back of what's going on in the US. So moving on to the oilseed side, again, if we just have a quick look at what's happened with prices over the last year, we often look at rapeseed prices alongside soybean prices because they tend to be heavily influenced by the US soybean market. But actually, you can see from this graph that this year rapeseed's kind of moved in its own separate market, and it hasn't necessarily followed the downward trend of soybean markets. And that premium of rapeseed over soybeans is really quite high now. So why is that? Well, if we look at sort of the overall supply of oilseeds globally, so that includes everything from soybeans, rapeseed, sunflowers, and so on, actually we're seeing a bit of a rebound in supply. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the stocks-to-use ratio. So that basically gives us an idea of how tightly balanced supply and demand is. So the smaller that percentage is, the tighter supply and demand is, essentially. So we're seeing that rebound back up to 19%. And as you can see, that's the highest since the peak in sort of 2018-19. So we're quite well supplied for total oilseeds, but actually, if we look at rapeseed specifically, so on the right-hand side, these are the key producers of rapeseed globally and the major exporters of rapeseed. And you can see that every single major exporter of rapeseed is forecast a decline this season in rapeseed production. So that's why we're seeing such a big premium of rapeseed over soybeans, and it's sort of reacting in its own way and not necessarily moving with the bearish sentiment in soybeans either. So again, if we just have a look at the factors to watch for oilseeds, tariffs, again, on both the bearish and bullish side of things, depending on what we see over the next few weeks or potentially months. The impact of that, again, is just it's very volatile at the moment, probably more of an impact in oilseeds on the grain side, like I said. We have also got heavy Brazilian and US soybean supplies as well. And again, that GDP picture factoring into the bearish sentiment as well. Limited domestic and global supplies could keep those rapeseed prices supported versus soybeans, probably what we would expect in at least the sort of short to mid-term. And we do follow quite closely what's going on with palm oil in sort of Indonesia and Malaysia as well, as that can have quite a big impact. So now if we have a quick look at what's going on domestically, first of all, I'm just going to give a bit of an overview as to supply and demand for this season. So just to explain these charts, because I think they're a bit sort of confusing when you first look at them, but basically the 3 bars on the left are our supplies, so kind of the opening stocks, production, imports, and then the 3 bars on the right are how we're going to use those supplies. So for wheat, we headed into the season with just under 3 million tonnes of wheat in stocks, which is very heavy, actually up about 53% on the year. We obviously then had much smaller wheat crop last year, for obvious reasons. So those heavier stocks partially offset that loss in domestic production, but sort of not enough to fulfill our domestic demand requirement. So because of that, we've had to import a lot of wheat to sort of cover our domestic requirement. So in March, we estimated that full season wheat imports would be at about 2.7 million tonnes, and that's versus sort of a much lower, that's well above average, and actually this season to date, that's sort of a record level that we're at the moment, up till sort of end of February, which is where we've got data up to. So that's sort of where our supplies are coming from. We've then obviously got how we're going to use that. So H&I usage is human industrial, so that sort of covers off flour milling, bioethanol and starch, and sort of a bit of distilling as well for wheat. And actually at just over 7.4 million tonnes, that's down a bit on what we'd maybe expect, and that's sort of on the back of a bit steadier distilling and also quite steady usage by the bioethanol sector. So we know at the moment neither of the UK bioethanol plants are running at full capacity, and we've got quite competitive US ethanol imports coming in at the moment. Although obviously that will be a bit of a watch point in terms of what happens with trade, what that could mean for ethanol prices as well. We've also then got the animal feed side of things. So again, that's quite a bit lower than what we would expect, largely to do with the much smaller crop and also just the relative price between wheat and barley. So they'll sort of substitute wheat and barley depending on the relative price to each other. And so this year we've seen a big switch to barley over wheat, largely due to its sort of availability and therefore price. And so at the end of that, we're actually left with a higher than average balance because of that reduction in consumption. But actually, because we're not exporting very much and we're not very export competitive this season, ending stocks, we're currently estimating them at about 2.7 million tonnes, which is well above the average of about 2.1 million tonnes. So we're expecting to head into the next season with very heavy wheat ending stocks. And that's quite important for maybe what it means for barley as well, in terms of what's competitively priced in sort of feed heading into next season. So on the barley side, it's quite a similar picture actually. We sort of had average opening stocks, average production. We never import too much barley. We're quite self-sufficient on that side compared to wheat in terms of how that's used. H&I usage, which is basically brewing, malting and distilling, is down quite a bit on average. It's quite steady at the moment. I think sort of trends of fewer young people choosing to consume alcohol, malt exports were also quite steady beginning of the season, so sort of international demand, and just that higher cost of living and potentially a bit of lack of recovery post-COVID on sort of GDP and economic growth as well. However, on the animal feed side, it's been quite strong, as I said, versus wheat. We've seen quite a lot used there, but similarly, exports haven't been very competitive. There hasn't been too much demand on the continent for malting barley in particular. Obviously, we had quite a bigger malting barley crop last year due to the weather conditions, and a lot of Western Europe kind of had a similar situation as well. So again, heading into next year with heavier ending stocks than we'd probably expect in a normal year. So that kind of leads quite nicely into looking a little bit at premiums. So like I was saying, because of that steadier demand from brewing, malting and distilling, and because of the sort of extent of supply of how much malting barley there is in the country at the moment, we have seen that gap between feed and malting barley shrink quite a bit. So if you look back to sort of 23, 24, we obviously benefited from those quite high premiums for malting barley, whereas that's dropped back quite significantly on the back of those factors that I just mentioned. And on the right there, that just gives a little bit of context, looking at sort of retail volume. So that looks at basically the year 2024 versus the year 2023, and the sort of comparisons. You can see spirits especially have seen quite a decline over the last couple of years. Beer and lager saw quite a decline in 2023, but actually not too much change in 2024. But I think, you know, we were not expecting to see much recovery anytime soon in the volume of those retail sales. So looking ahead to harvest 25, we don't have kind of production scenarios for the spring crops yet, so I don't have one for barley and oats, because obviously a lot of that is made up of the spring crop. But for wheat and rapeseed, we've just put together these initial production scenarios. So for this, we use our early bird survey, which is carried out in November. And then we sort of combine that with either a minimum or an average or a maximum yield. So I would think at the moment for wheat, we're sort of looking about average in terms of conditions, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And probably sort of around the 13 to 13.5 million tonne mark is kind
of. Olivia, you've gone. I don't know where you've gone, but you've gone. All we can see is there you go. You're back. And now we can't hear you.
Is that better?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Don't know what happened then. So where was I? Yeah, so I think anecdotally in the industry, we're probably looking at about 13 million to 13.5 million tonnes for that wheat crop. So not sort of back to the average of about 14 million tonnes that we'd expect, but a bit of a rebound compared to that much smaller crop that we obviously had last season. Again, on the rapeseed side of things, similar thing, sort of depending on what yield we see, it could be quite varied, but at the moment probably sort of looking at around the average yield. We could be at about an 800,000 tonne crop, so still kind of down on sort of average and what we would expect. But I think, you know, for rapeseed, it's probably expected that, you know, area and yields are sort of suffering a bit as time goes on. So moving on to conditions, which might give us a bit of a better idea about yield. This is our crop condition report that we've just had out in March. So we'll get one of these monthly for the next few months, kind of up to harvest. And this basically gives us an indication of what to expect from yield. So we follow the US Department of Agriculture's sort of model, where they'll have different condition levels. So the levels of good or excellent basically mean that the yield is either in line with normal or it's above normal. So this graph on the left basically shows the proportion of the UK crop that is estimated to be normal or above normal in terms of yield potential. So you can see everything as you'd probably expect, well above where we were last year. Couldn't get much worse really than last year, so we would expect that significant increase, but actually still a little bit down on where we were in 2023. I think obviously from listening to those previous presentations, still quite a long way to go, and maybe the more sort of volatile weather recently might have an impact sort of moving forward. And on the right hand side, I've just put the Scotland figures versus the UK figures, and actually you can see that sort of across the winter crops, generally Scotland seems to be faring a bit better than the rest of the UK, apart from on the OSR side of things as well. So just sort of bring that together. In terms of our domestic wheat futures, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the sort of carry from old crop to new crop. So at the moment, we've got quite a significant premium for new crop wheat futures over old crop. A lot of that is to do with how much old crop wheat we've got left over in the country, and also sort of conditions of new crop as well, being very much in focus, and sort of the wider global markets as well. So this is a similar situation as in the US, and we're obviously sort of following that trend. But I think it's just something to consider when you're marketing either your old crop grain or thinking about marketing new crop grain as well. Definitely something to sort of take advantage of if you're thinking of forward selling or marketing next year's grain. So just to round up, a bit of a summary on the global grain side, we've obviously got that grain deficit that we spoke about, but sort of that uncertainty in demand is maybe offsetting the impact of that. We've got increased maize supplies predicted for next year, which again is sort of keeping that more bearish sentiment. But at the moment, the focus is very much on the development of new crop in the Northern Hemisphere. For oilseeds, we've got that heavier stocks to use ratio, so overall pretty well supplied on the oilseed side, but we've still got the tighter rapeseed supplies and the doubts over what's going on in the US and what that could mean for global trade disputes. We've also got heavy South American supplies as well. And then on the domestic side of things, those smaller crops with the greater reliance on imports, prices are still very much determined by sort of what's going on internationally. And we've also got question marks over demand, and those heavy stocks that we're heading into next year could kind of limit the support and our sort of relationship to the global market. And the key sort of watch point at the moment is the recovery of our domestic supplies as we move into next year. So I think that's about it from me. Thank you very much, and I'll hand back over to Adrian for the questions.
Yeah, we don't have any questions, Olivia. So thank you very much for that. And we will, we will move on to the last slide of the night, thankfully. So if for some unknown reason that's not what we were looking for, but never mind. I can do without that. Before we wrap it up, I just want to thank all of the presenters, Morvin and Emma and Georgia and Olivia, for doing all of the work tonight. I know we've packed a lot in, and we probably should have allowed for a bit more, but a bit more time. So I do apologise for that. If anybody has any questions that they would like to get back to me with later on, please do. You can email them to me. Just a couple of things to look for on our website. We've got a couple of events coming up in the summer. The first one is the 5th of June. That is a day all about IPM. If you go onto the AHDB events webpage, you can find that and log in and register. We've also doing this year, because there is no Arable Scotland, the RL team are going to be at the Scottish Agronomy trial site in Fife on the 1st of July. Again, if you go onto the AHDB website, you can register. It would be great to see you all there. There are all sorts of things on the AHDB website if you want to go on there and look for all of the tools on there. Also, if you feel you're not getting information from AHDB on events coming up and meetings and things like webinars and that, you can also go onto the AHDB preference page and select your personal preferences. Unfortunately, due to GDPR, we can't do it for you. You need to do that, and then you will get information from us. So quickly, just to wrap everything up, thank you all for attending. Hopefully it's been useful. If you have any ideas for future webinars, again, just let me know, because we would like to do some more. And thank you all for logging on. And have a lovely Easter, and I will see you soon.